smell of wet straw and old iron was the first thing Elena Harrow noticed every morning, and the last thing she carried into her dreams every night. She lay on a thin bedroll wedged between two feed troughs, the wool blanket pulled to her chin, listening. Outside the Thornridge Pack compound stirred with the low pre-dawn energy of 100 wolves preparing for patrol. Boots on frost, the scrape of weapon racks. Somewhere beyond the eastern tree line, a howl long sustained, threaded with authority, signaled the changing of the night guard. Elena did not howl back. She never could. She sat up slowly, pressing her palm against the rough plank wall for balance. The cold had crept through the barn's gaps overnight and settled deep in her joints. She was 21 years old, lean as a birch sapling, with dark copper hair she kept braided tight against her skull. Her eyes were a strange, muted amber wolf, colored her mother had once said, as if the goddess had started painting her soul and then simply stopped. No wolf, no shift, no inner voice. She was hollow. The word followed her like a shadow with teeth. Children whispered it when she passed the schoolyard. Warriors muttered it over their ale. Even the kitchen women, who sometimes slipped her scraps of bread when no one was looking, said it with a particular softness, as if gentleness could blunt the edge of what it meant. Hollow, empty, a body with no spirit animal curled inside it. In a world where your wolf defined your worth, your rank, your very right to exist, Elena was a living contradiction. A shifter who could not shift. A pack member who belonged to no pack. Her mother had died when Elena was 6. A lung fever that took her in the night quietly without the drama that Thornridge seemed to demand of everything else. After that, there had been no one to argue for her place. No one to insist that the wolfless girl deserved a bed inside the longhouse, a seat at the communal table, a coat that fit. The pack had simply moved her to the barn, the way one might move a broken tool to the shed. Not out of malice exactly, but out of a certainty that broken things belonged in broken places. 15 years. She had been 6 years old when they carried her bedroll across the frozen courtyard and left it here among the hounds and the feed sacks and the winter stores. 15 years of waking to the smell of animals and hay. 15 years of eating scraps. 15 years of watching the pack move through its rituals, the hunts, the ceremonies, the bonds, and knowing she would never be part of them. She pulled on her boots, hand-me-downs, 2 sizes too large, stuffed with rags at the toes, and crossed to the barn door. The hinges screamed. The courtyard beyond lay in blue-gray light, the frost so thick it looked like the earth had grown a skin of glass. Across the yard stood the Alpha's longhouse, a massive timber structure with carved wolf skulls flanking the entrance. Smoke curled from the central chimney. Inside, Alpha Declan Voss and his family would be eating roasted venison, honeyed bread. The scent drifted over to her in waves rich and cruel. Her stomach tightened, but she did not let herself linger on it. Instead, she moved to the well, hauled up a bucket of near-frozen water, and carried it to the kennels. The hounds' thick-bodied mastiffs, bred for tracking, pressed their noses through the slats and whimpered when they saw her. She poured water into their trough, then reached through the fence to scratch behind the ears of the eldest, a scarred female named Brine. "Morning, old girl," Elena murmured. Brine licked her knuckles. The sensation, warm, rough, alive, sent a flicker of something through Elena's chest. Not quite joy, closer to recognition. The hounds were the only creatures in the compound who did not recoil from her scent, or rather from her lack of one. Wolves smelled of pine iron musk territory. Elena smelled of nothing, an absence, a blank page in a world that read identity through the nose. She reached into her coat pocket and closed her fingers around a small, smooth object, a riverstone, oval and pale gray with a single vein of white quartz running through its center like a promise carved in mineral. She had found it 3 years ago, the morning after a particularly bad night. The night Beta Garrick Thorn had held her by the throat against the barn wall and told her she should have died at birth. She had walked to the river at dawn numb, and the stone had been sitting on the bank as if waiting for her. She carried it everywhere now, not as a talisman, not for luck, but because it was proof that the world could still produce something smooth from something broken. That pressure and water and time could make a rough thing beautiful. That was the thought she held inside her chest, pressed tight like the stone in her fist, as she heard the commotion erupt from the Alpha's longhouse. The shouting reached her before the scent of blood did. Elena straightened from the kennel gate and turned toward the longhouse. 2 warriors, broad-shouldered men in leather and fur, came through the main doors carrying something between them. A bundle, small, wrapped in a stained wool blanket that had once been white and was now the dull rust color of dried blood. A child. The cub was maybe 4 years old, limp as a skinned rabbit head, lolling against the warrior's forearm. Even from 40 yards away, Elena could see the fever flush across the child's face, a deep, angry red that spoke of something burning from inside. The cub's lips were cracked. Its small fingers twitched against the air, reaching for something that was not there. Behind the warriors came Alpha Declan Voss. He was enormous. 6 feet 5 inches tall, 37 years old, carved from a lineage of warwolves with a jaw like the prow of a ship and eyes the color of hammered steel. His dark hair was pulled back from his face in a warrior's knot, and even in the gray morning light, his presence hit like a physical force. A pressure in the air, a weight on the spine, the Alpha aura. Every wolf within 50 yards felt the compulsion to lower their eyes, bare their throats, submit. Elena felt nothing, another cruelty of her condition. Or perhaps a mercy. She had watched Declan command for years from the periphery of pack life, had seen the way his voice could flatten a room, the way his presence could make seasoned warriors drop their eyes like scolded children. She understood intellectually that the Alpha aura was a biological reality, a pheromonal and psychic force embedded in the bloodline designed by evolution or the goddess or both to maintain order in a society of predators. But understanding it and feeling it were different things. To Elena, Declan's commands were just sounds. Loud sounds, heavy with intent, but sounds nonetheless, like thunder without lightning. To the river, Declan said. His voice carried the deep, reverberating quality of an alpha command, not a suggestion, not a request. The words landed like stones in the chest of every wolf present. Leave it on the bank. The compound froze. Elena watched as the silence spread outward like a crack in ice. Warriors paused mid-step. A young she-wolf on the longhouse porch pressed her hand over her mouth. Even the hounds behind Elena went still, ears flat, as if the wrongness of the command had reached them through some channel deeper than language. The cub was the last surviving child of the Thornborn line, a bloodline that had challenged Declan's father for the Alpha seat 3 decades ago and lost. The punishment had been absolute. Every Thornborn wolf was stripped of rank, scattered, or killed. But somehow, impossibly, a cub had surfaced, born in secret, hidden by a dead she-wolf in a border village. Found last week by Declan's scouts, feverish and alone in a collapsed den. And Declan had decided that the bloodline would end here. Elena had heard the story in fragments, whispered between the kitchen women, muttered by the stable hands, pieced together from the overheard conversations of wolves who did not bother to lower their voices around the hollow girl. The Thornborn challenge had been the defining trauma of the previous generation. Declan's father, Magnus the Elder, had crushed it with a brutality that still echoed through the compound's architecture. The scorch marks on the eastern wall, the empty dens beyond the training ground that no one had rebuilt, the unspoken rule that the Thornborn name was never to be spoken aloud. Until now, until this fevered, gasping child had made the name real again, not by Declan's hand that would stain his honor, but by neglect, by the river, by the cold. The warriors carried the cub across the courtyard, past the training grounds, down the sloping bank toward the frozen edge of the Thornridge River. Elena followed at a distance, her boots cracking the frost, her breath pluming white in the air. She did not know why she followed. She had no standing, no authority, no voice in the pack's decisions. She was less than the lowest omega. She was nothing. But the cub's hand was still reaching. The warriors set the bundle down on the riverbank, on a flat stretch of frozen mud between 2 bare willows. The cub made a small sound, not a cry, not a word, just a thin, reedy exhale like a bellows with a hole in it. The blanket fell open. Underneath the child was skeletal, ribs visible, skin stretched tight over a frame that seemed too fragile to hold a heartbeat. Declan stood on the bank above his arms, crossed his jaw set. Around him, 30 wolves watched in silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The Alpha had commanded. The Alpha's word was law. Elena's fingers found the riverstone in her pocket and squeezed. She thought of pressure, water, time. She thought of the smooth thing that rough things could become. And then she walked forward. The moment Elena stepped past the line of warriors, the air changed. It was not a dramatic shift, no crack of thunder, no flash of light. It was subtler than that. A tightening, as if the atmosphere itself had drawn a breath and held it. 30 wolves turned their eyes to the hollow girl, walking through their ranks with her oversized boots and her threadbare coat, and her braid coming loose at the temples, and not a single one of them understood what they were seeing. Stop! Declan's voice hit her like a wall of sound. The Alpha command rippled outward, and every wolf in the vicinity flinched. Some dropped to a knee, others turned their heads away in reflexive submission. The compulsion was absolute, irresistible. Elena kept walking. She heard the intake of breath, a collective gasp that ran through the gathered wolves like wind through dry grass. The hollow girl, immune to the command, not because she was stronger, because she had nothing inside her for the command to grip. No wolf, no bond, no tether to the hierarchy that held every other creature in place. For the first time in her life, her emptiness was an armor. She could feel the astonishment radiating from the wolves around her. A physical thing hot and disorienting like standing too close to a bonfire. In 21 years, no one had ever defied an alpha command in Thornridge. The hierarchy was absolute. The chain was unbreakable. And yet here was the girl from the barn, the girl with no wolf and no scent and no standing, walking through the most powerful compulsion a shifter could produce as if it were nothing more than a stiff breeze. Some of the older wolves would later say they felt a chill run through them in that moment. Not of cold, but of recognition, of the world tilting on its axis and settling into a new position. I said stop. Declan's voice dropped lower harder. She heard his boots on the frozen ground behind her. Heavy, deliberate. You have no right to interfere, Hollow. Walk away, or I will have you dragged to the border and left for the rogues. Elena did not turn around. Her eyes were fixed on the cub. The child lay on the frozen mud, barely breathing. Up close, the fever was worse than she had thought. The skin was not just flushed, but translucent, as if the fire inside was burning the child down to light. The small chest rose and fell in shallow, erratic hitches. The fingers had stopped reaching. They lay curled against the frost like the legs of a dying insect. Elena knelt. The cold soaked through her knees, instantly biting through the thin fabric of her trousers. She reached out and carefully, gently gathered the cub into her arms. The child weighed almost nothing, a bundle of bones and heat and the faint, fading scent of something wild. Something that smelled like scorched pine and iron filings. Wolf scent, but fractured, broken. Behind her, she heard the rasp of metal, a spear being drawn. Put it down. Declan's voice was barely controlled now. She could hear the wolf beneath it, the growl, the territorial fury, the offended pride of a leader whose command had been publicly defied. That bloodline is condemned. You are interfering with pack justice. Elena looked down at the cub's face. The child's eyes were closed. The lashes were dark against the fever-bright cheeks. A vein pulsed weakly at the temple. Faint, irregular, counting down. She lowered her head, and she pressed her lips to the cub's forehead. The kiss was gentle, brief, the kind of gesture a mother might give a child at bedtime. Instinctive, unthinking, woven from some thread of tenderness that existed before language, before law, before the first wolf ever claimed dominion over the first pack. What happened next would be debated in Thornridge for generations. The cub's body shuddered once, a full-body tremor that Elena felt travel through her arms and into her chest. Then a light bloomed beneath the child's skin, not golden, not silver, white. A deep marrow-white radiance that pulsed from the cub's forehead, where Elena's lips had touched, spreading outward like frost forming on glass. Except this frost was warm. It traveled down the child's neck, across the tiny shoulders, along the arms, and the fever heat transformed. Not vanishing, but reorganizing, shifting from destruction to something else. Healing. Elena's breath caught. Her hands trembled. She felt something stir inside her chest, not a wolf, not a voice, but a vibration. A hum, as if a door she had never known existed had cracked open somewhere deep in the architecture of her soul, and through that crack poured a frequency she had no name for. The cub opened its eyes. They were violet, and behind Elena there was a sound like a tree falling, a heavy wooden crack followed by the clatter of metal on stone. She turned. Alpha Declan Voss was on his knees. His spear lay on the frozen ground beside him, dropped from fingers that hung limp at his sides. His steel gray eyes were wide, not with anger, not with command, with terror. The compound erupted. Wolves who had stood frozen in silence now surged forward, voices overlapping in a chaos of shock and reverence and fear. The white light from the cub had faded, but its afterimage seemed to linger in the air like the memory of lightning. A brightness that left everyone blinking, disoriented, uncertain of what they had just witnessed. Elena clutched the cub tighter. The child was breathing evenly now, deep, steady breaths that fogged in the cold air. The fever flush had receded, replaced by a healthy warmth that pulsed through the small body like a second heartbeat. The violet eyes blinked up at Elena with an expression of absolute, uncomplicated trust. Lunarisma. Someone whispered the word. It spread through the crowd like fire through kindling. Lunarisma, moon soul, a gift so rare it existed mostly in the oldest songs. The ability to channel the goddess's healing light through physical touch. Not a wolf's power, not an alpha's birthright, something older, something that predated the pack system entirely. From an age when the bond between wolf and goddess was not mediated by rank or blood or territory. And it had manifested in the hollow. The irony was not lost on Elena even in the chaos of the moment. The gift that the pack would have given anything to possess the sacred ancient power that connected a wolf directly to the goddess's grace had bypassed every ranked wolf, every alpha heir, every blooded warrior in the territory. It had settled instead in the one creature they had deemed worthless, as if the goddess had looked down at the hierarchy Thornridge had built and chosen to answer it with the most pointed rebuttal imaginable. That's impossible. Declan was on his feet now, but the authority in his voice had cracked. Elena could hear it, the hairline fracture running through the foundation of his certainty. She has no wolf. She has no connection to the goddess. She is chosen. The voice came from the edge of the crowd. The wolves parted, and through the gap walked Elder Morel, the pack's oldest living wolf. A woman of 93 who moved with the careful precision of someone who had outlived every war, every alpha, every tragedy that Thornridge had produced. Her white hair was unbound, her eyes milky with cataracts, and she leaned on a staff made from a lightning-struck oak. But when she spoke, even Declan went still. The Lunarisma does not choose the strong, Morel said, each word measured and deliberate. It does not choose the rank, the powerful, the worthy as the pack defines worthy. She turned her clouded eyes toward Elena. It chooses the empty, the ones who have been hollowed out by suffering until there is nothing left inside them but space. She paused. Space for the goddess to fill. Elena felt the cub's small hand close around her finger. The grip was surprisingly strong. The words settled over the crowd like snow. Quiet, inexorable, covering everything. Elena felt them land on her shoulders, her chest the crown of her head. She did not know if she believed them. She had spent 21 years being told that her emptiness was a deficiency, a punishment, a cosmic error. The idea that it might be something else entirely, a preparation, a hollowing out that made room for grace, was so foreign to her internal landscape that she could not yet map it. But the cub in her arms was warm. The cub in her arms was breathing. And whatever had poured through her hands on that riverbank had been real enough to make an alpha fall to his knees. That at least she could not deny. This changes nothing, Declan said, but his voice had lost its steel. The Thornborn line is condemned. The cub is healed, Morel interrupted, and the sharpness in her tone made several wolves flinch, healed by a gift that has not appeared in Thornridge in 400 years. If you harm this child now, Alpha, you do not defy a bloodline. You defy the goddess herself. She paused. And the last Alpha who did that is buried beneath the standing stones with no name on his grave. The silence that followed was absolute. Declan's jaw worked. His hands opened and closed at his sides. Elena could see the war playing out behind his eyes. Pride against fear. Authority against something ancient and ungovernable. He was an alpha. He had been raised to believe that his word was the final word, that the pack's survival depended on the absoluteness of his power. To concede now in front of his wolves to the hollow girl, it would break something inside him. She could see that too. Take the cub to the infirmary, Declan said finally. The words came out flat, drained of command. He did not look at Elena. He looked at the river. And keep the hollow under watch. I want to know everything about this gift. He said the word like it tasted of ash. Two she-wolves approached Elena carefully as if she were a wild animal that might bolt. She let them guide her toward the infirmary, the cub still cradled against her chest. As she walked, she felt the river stone shift in her pocket, pressing against her thigh. Smooth from rough, beautiful from broken. She held the cub closer and did not look back. 3 days passed, and the compound became a place Elena no longer recognized. Wolves who had spent years avoiding her gaze now stopped in the corridors when she passed, pressing their backs against the walls, as if making room for someone important. Some bowed their heads, not in submission, but in something more unsettling. Reverence. A few of the younger she-wolves left small offerings outside the infirmary door, where Elena slept beside the cub. Bundles of dried sage, strips of cured meat, a carved wooden figure of the moon goddess with her arms raised. Elena did not know what to do with any of it. The cub whose name she had learned was Ash Thornborn recovered with startling speed. Within a day, the child was sitting up. Within 2, walking. By the 3rd morning, Ash was following Elena around the infirmary with a quiet, watchful intensity that the healers found remarkable. The child rarely spoke, but the violet eyes tracked Elena's every movement with an expression that was equal parts gravity and devotion. He has imprinted on you, said Nessa, the head healer, a soft-spoken woman with kind hands and careful eyes. It happens sometimes with very young wolves who experience a near-death trauma. Their instinct latches onto the first source of safety. For Ash, that is you. Elena looked at the boy who was sitting on the infirmary floor, arranging small stones in a careful pattern. I don't have a wolf, she said. I can't be what he needs. Nessa was quiet for a moment. Perhaps what he needs is not a wolf. Perhaps what he needs is exactly what you gave him on that riverbank. But if the compound's attitude toward Elena was shifting, its attitude toward Declan was shifting faster and in a direction that terrified him. She saw the evidence in fragments, hushed conversations that stopped when the Alpha entered a room. Warriors who obeyed his orders a half-beat slower than before. The subtle, almost imperceptible loosening of the invisible threads that bound a pack to its leader. Declan's authority had always rested on two pillars, his bloodline and his certainty. The certainty that his judgments were just, that his commands served the pack, that the hierarchy he enforced was the natural order of the world. Elena had cracked both pillars in a single act. She had not meant to. She had not planned a revolution or a reckoning. She had simply walked toward a dying child because no one else would. And in doing so, she had exposed the fault line that ran beneath everything Declan had built. The unexamined assumption that power and rightness were the same thing, that the strong were strong because they deserved to be, that the weak suffered because suffering was their nature. It was the lie at the heart of every hierarchy that had ever existed, and Elena had cracked it open, not with force or rhetoric, but with a kiss on a child's forehead. On the evening of the third day, Declan came to the infirmary. He came alone, which was unusual. Alphas traveled with escorts. It was protocol, tradition, a display of status. But Declan entered through the side door with no warriors flanking him, no beta at his shoulder. He wore a simple linen shirt instead of his armored leather, and his dark hair hung loose around his face. Without the trappings of his rank, he looked younger, raw, like a man instead of a monument. Elena was sitting by the window, Ash asleep in her lap. She felt Declan's presence before she saw him. Not the alpha aura, which had no effect on her, but the sheer physical weight of him, the way the air pressure changed when someone that large entered a small room. He stood in the doorway and looked at the sleeping child. "My father killed Ash's grandfather," Declan said. No preamble, no command tone, just the words laid out bare as bones. "Broke his neck in front of the whole pack. Then he burned the Thornborn dens and salted the ground. I was 7. I watched from the longhouse window." He paused. "I thought it was justice. I thought that was what strength looked like." Elena said nothing. She waited. "When I ordered the cub taken to the river, I told myself I was protecting the pack, preventing a future threat, honoring my father's legacy." His voice was low, rough, stripped of its usual authority. "But I was not protecting anyone. I was performing. I was showing the pack that I was as strong as my father, that I could be as merciless." He looked at Elena, and the steel in his eyes had thinned to something almost translucent. "You walked through my command like it was not there." "It was not there," Elena said quietly. "For me, it never has been." Something shifted in Declan's expression, a flicker of pain or recognition or both. He looked at the sleeping cub, then at the carved goddess figure on the windowsill, then at Elena's hands. Rough, calloused, steady. "I do not know how to be an alpha who was wrong," he said. "You learned, Yan," Elena said, "the same way I learned to survive in your barn, one morning at a time." Declan stood there for a long moment, silhouetted against the dying light. Then he turned and left without another word. But as Elena watched him go, she noticed something she had never seen before. His shoulders were not quite as square as they had been when he entered, and his hands hanging at his sides were trembling. The morning of the fourth day broke cold and clear over Thornridge, the kind of brittle Montana dawn where the sky looked like hammered glass and the frost made everything sharp enough to cut. Elena woke to the sound of voices in the courtyard below. Not shouting, not yet, but the murmur of gathered wolves, that low sustained rumble that preceded either celebration or violence, and in her experience, celebration was rare. She rose carefully, trying not to wake Ash, who was curled against her side like a comma made of warmth and trust. The child's breathing was even now deep and steady, the violet eyes moving beneath closed lids in whatever dream occupied a 4-year-old who had been pulled back from death by light and will. Elena moved to the window. Below in the stone circle at the northern edge of the compound, perhaps 50 wolves had gathered. More were arriving. She recognized the postures, the particular tension in shoulders and spines. They were waiting for something. Someone. A trial. She dressed quickly, pulling on new clothes that Nessa had insisted she accept, not the threadbare rags she had worn for years, but a simple wool dress in forest green, sturdy boots that fit a coat lined with rabbit fur. The transformation felt strange on her skin, as if she were wearing someone else's life. She left Ash with one of the younger healers and made her way down to the courtyard. The wolves parted as she approached, not dramatically, but with that same unsettling deference she had noticed for 3 days now. A space opening in the crowd. Room made for something they did not quite understand, but had learned very suddenly not to dismiss. At the center of the stone circle stood Declan. And beside him, bound in iron chains, knelt Beta Garrick Thorne. The man who had held her by the throat 3 years ago and told her she should have died at birth looked smaller. Now diminished somehow, though his body was still the same mountain of muscle and scar tissue it had always been. But there was something in his posture, a collapse of certainty that made him seem less than he had been. Or perhaps Elena had simply grown larger. Elder Morel stood to Declan's right, her lightning-struck oak staff planted in the frozen ground like a declaration. To his left stood Nessa and 3 other wolves Elena recognized as the pack's informal council, the ones who settled disputes over hunting grounds and marriage contracts and the 1,000 small fractures that occurred when predators tried to live as a society. Declan raised his hand and the murmuring ceased. Beta Garrick Thorne, he said, and his voice carried across the circle without the weight of alpha command, just the flat declarative tone of someone reading charges from a ledger. You stand accused of crimes against this pack: physical assault, financial theft, conspiracy to commit treason. The silence that followed was absolute. Garrick lifted his head, and Elena saw something flicker in his eyes. Not shame, not regret, something colder. A calculation still running even now. Even here trying to find the angle that would let him survive. On what grounds, Garrick said. His voice was rough damaged as if he had spent the night screaming. Perhaps he had. I served this pack for 20 years. I enforced your father's law. I kept order when you strangled an Omega against a barn wall. Declan interrupted, and the flatness in his tone was somehow worse than anger. 3 years ago, winter. You told her she should have died at birth. Elena felt every eye in the circle turn toward her. She did not look away. She had no standing, Garrick said. No wolf, no rank. I was within my rights to rights, Morel said, and the word came out like a stone dropping into still water, sending ripples of silence outward. You speak of rights. Tell me, Beta, where in our law does it say that those without wolves are outside the goddess's protection? Garrick's jaw worked. The hollow are not what? Morel's clouded eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made several wolves shift uncomfortably. Are not wolves true? Are not pack, that was your doing, not hers, are not worthy of the goddess's grace? She lifted her staff and pointed it at Elena. The lunarisma manifested in her. The gift that has not appeared in Thornridge for 400 years chose the one you deemed worthless. If you were within your rights to assault her, then the goddess herself is wrong. She paused, letting the weight of that settle. And if the goddess is wrong, Beta, then we are all lost. Garrick said nothing, but the silence was its own kind of admission. Bring forth the witnesses, Declan said. What followed was methodical, surgical, a dismantling not just of Garrick's defense, but of the logic that had allowed him to operate unchecked for 2 decades. 7 Omegas came forward, one by one, each with a story. A young woman named Kira, who Garrick had shoved into a wall during a feast, fracturing her collarbone because she had accidentally spilled ale on his boots. An older male Omega, Tomas, who Garrick had denied medical treatment after a hunting accident, saying weakness should not be coddled. A teenage girl, Senna, barely 16, who Garrick had cornered in the smokehouse and touched in ways that made her voice shake even now, 3 years later, in the telling. Elena listened to each testimony and felt something cold and hard forming in her chest. Not quite anger, closer to understanding. She had thought her suffering was singular, personal, the particular cruelty of one man toward one girl. But it was not, it was systemic. A pattern woven so deeply into the fabric of Thornridge that no one had thought to call it wrong, until a hollow girl walked through an alpha command and made them look at what they had built. After the Omegas came the warriors. Corin, the broad-shouldered man with the scar splitting his left eyebrow, who testified that he had seen Garrick take money from the pack's emergency stores. $12,000 over 4 years. Small amounts carefully hidden in the accounting, funneled into a private account that Garrick had thought no one knew about. But Corin knew. He had been the one who balanced the books. He had said nothing because Garrick was Beta and Corin was just a warrior, and who would believe him anyway? I was afraid, Corin said, and his voice cracked on the word. I told myself it was not my place to question, that the hierarchy existed for a reason. He looked at Elena. I was wrong. Then came Thane, the lean, dark-haired scout who had found Ash in the collapsed den. He carried a leather satchel which he opened carefully as if it contained something fragile. Inside were papers, written logs, dated, detailed. Correspondence between Garrick and 2 other warriors, Jax and Ren, discussing a plan to challenge Declan for the alpha seat. Not through formal combat, which would at least have been honest, but through poison. Wolfsbane and the alpha's evening meal. A slow death that would look like illness. And then when Declan was weak, when the pack was destabilized by grief and uncertainty, Garrick would step forward as the strong hand needed to restore order. Where did you get these? Declan asked, and his voice was very quiet. Guard tower, Thane said, hidden in a false bottom of Garrick's footlocker. I found them 2 nights ago after the Lunarisma manifested. I went looking because... He hesitated. Because if the goddess chose her, then everything we thought we knew was wrong. And if that was wrong, what else might be? He looked at Garrick. Turns out quite a lot. The beta said nothing, but something in his expression had shifted. The calculation was gone. What remained was emptiness. The hollow recognition of a man who had bet everything on a hierarchy that no longer held and lost. Jax and Ren, Declan said, bring them forward. The 2 warriors were already present, standing at the edge of the circle. They came forward slowly, reluctantly, like men walking to an execution, which in a sense they were. Is this true? Declan asked. Jax, the younger of the 2, looked at the ground. His hands were shaking. He promised us beta positions, Jax said, after you were gone. He said the pack needed strong leadership, that your reforms, the talk of ending the barn system of giving standing to the hollow, would destroy us. And you believed him, Declan said. We did. Why? Jax finally looked up, and there was something almost pleading in his eyes. Because it was easier, he said. Easier than admitting we were wrong. Easier than looking at what we had done, what I had done, and calling it cruelty instead of tradition. The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Then Declan spoke. Elder Morell, I defer to your judgment. What is the sentence for assault of pack members, theft of pack resources, and conspiracy to commit murder of an alpha? Morell was quiet for a long moment, her staff planted in the frozen earth, her clouded eyes fixed on something beyond the circle. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 9 decades and every mistake Thornridge had made in that time. Garrick Thorn, you are stripped of your rank and all privileges associated with it. Your property, 40 acres of hunting land, 12 head of livestock, $8,000 in silver and currency, is forfeit to Elena Harrow as restitution for damages inflicted. Garrick's face went white. You are exiled from Thornridge territory for a period of 10 years. If you return before that time, you will be killed on sight. If you harm another Omega in any territory during that exile, we will hunt you to the ends of the earth, and the goddess will not protect you. She turned to Jax and Ren. For you, 5 years exile each. You were complicit, but you were also used. That is not absolution, but it is mitigation. Serve your exile. Learn what strength actually means. If you return, return better. She looked at Declan. Let it be witnessed. Let it be recorded. Let it be known that Thornridge does not tolerate cruelty, no matter how deeply woven into tradition it has become. Declan nodded once sharp and final. Guards, remove them. As the warriors dragged Garrick to his feet, the beta looked across the circle and found Elena's eyes. For a moment, she saw something raw and unguarded in his expression. Not hatred, not even anger, just a terrible bewilderment, as if he genuinely could not understand how the world had shifted so completely beneath his feet. You think this ends with me, he said, and his voice was hoarse, breaking. There are others, warriors loyal to the old ways. They will come for you, Hollow. They will come for the Alpha who kneels. And when they do, then they will face the same justice you did, Elena said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. The old ways are dying, Garrick. Not because I willed it, not because the Alpha commanded it, but because they were built on suffering, and the goddess has decided that suffering is no longer the price of survival. She paused. You can fight that if you want, but you cannot win. Garrick opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it. There was nothing left to say. The guards pulled him toward the northern gate, toward exile, toward a future that no longer had a place for men like him. Jax and Ren followed their heads, bowed their shoulders, collapsed inward, like structures, finally admitting the weight they could no longer bear. And as they disappeared through the gate, as the compound watched in silence, Elena felt something shift inside her chest. Not triumph, not vindication, just the quiet recognition that justice, when it finally came, was often less dramatic than anyone expected. No lightning, no divine intervention, just people choosing one small decision at a time to stop tolerating the intolerable. The crowd began to disperse slowly, wolves drifting back toward the longhouse, the training grounds, the rhythms of ordinary life. But several stayed. Corin approached Elena first. The warrior with the scarred eyebrow, who had balanced the books and said nothing for years. He stood at a careful distance, as if unsure of the protocol for addressing someone who had been invisible for 2 decades and was now the most talked about wolf in the territory. I wanted to say something. He began, then stopped. His jaw worked. He tried again. 3 winters ago, when you were ill with chest fever, I was on barn duty. I saw you shaking through the wall slats. I could have brought you a blanket from the stores. He looked at the ground. I did not. I told myself it was not my responsibility. That you were, that the barn was. He broke off. I'm sorry, I should have brought the blanket. Elena looked at him for a long moment, looked at the way his hands were clenched at his sides, the way his shoulders curved inward, as if trying to make himself smaller. Looked at the genuine anguish in his face. Thank you, she said. Not for the apology exactly, but for the proof that the pack's transformation was not just happening at the level of proclamations and policy. It was happening in the small private spaces where shame lived. The places where individuals reckoned with the specific ways they had participated in collective cruelty. Corin nodded once sharp and military, then turned and walked away. But he walked differently than he had arrived. Shoulders back, spine straight, as if something heavy had been set down. After Corin came Iris Meadowbrook, one of the kitchen women. She was perhaps 50, with gray streaked hair and hands that were permanently stained from years of working with beets and berries and the dark, strong tea the pack favored. She carried a cloth-wrapped bundle which she held out to Elena like an offering. I have fed you scraps for 10 years, Iris said, and her voice trembled. Table scraps, like you were a dunk. She unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a loaf of bread, fresh, still warm, the kind of dense honey-sweetened bread that was served at the Alpha's table during feasts. My daughter is 8 years old, Iris continued. If she were hollow, I would want someone to give her more than scraps. I would want someone to see her as worthy of fresh bread. She placed the loaf in Elena's hands. I baked this for you, not leftover, not extra, for you. Elena took the bread, feeling the warmth of it against her palms, and something in her chest cracked open. Not dramatically, just a small fissure, the kind pressure creates over time, and through it came a feeling she did not immediately recognize because she had felt it so rarely. Belonging. Thank you, she said and meant it. Iris nodded, her eyes bright with tears she did not quite shed, and walked back toward the kitchens. Then came Finn the stable boy. 12 years old, all knees and elbows, in the particular awkwardness of someone growing faster than his coordination could manage. He stood in front of Elena and would not meet her eyes. I used to throw rocks at the barn roof to scare you, he said. His voice was barely audible. I am sorry. Why did you do it? Elena asked. Finn finally looked up, and his face was miserable. Because the older boys did. Because no one stopped us. Elena knelt so they were at eye level. And if you saw someone doing it now, what would you do? Finn's jaw set. I would stop them. Good, Elena said. Then you have learned what the older boys never did. She stood. Thank you for telling me. Finn nodded and ran off, disappearing into the warren of paths between buildings, and Elena watched him go with something like hope stirring in her chest. The pack was changing. Not completely, not overnight, but in small increments, in individual reckonings, in the space between what had been and what might be if they were brave enough to reach for it. By the time the sun reached its apex, Elena found herself back in the small room at the end of the east corridor that Nessa had given her 3 days ago. The room with the window facing the river. The room that was hers not by sufferance or charity, but by right. She set the loaf of bread on the windowsill beside the carved goddess figure in the river stone. 3 objects now. 3 small pieces of proof that the world could be different than it had been. There was a knock at the door. Come in, Elena said. Declan entered, and this time he looked even more stripped of his usual armor than he had the previous evening. He wore plain clothes, his hair was loose, and there was something in his face that Elena had never seen before in the 12 years she had watched him from the periphery of pack life. Uncertainty. He stood in the doorway, not quite crossing the threshold as if waiting for permission. May I? He asked. Elena nodded. He came in and stood by the window, looking out at the river, at the bare willows, at the place where she had knelt 3 days ago and changed everything. I have been thinking, Declan said, about what you said last night, about learning, one morning at a time. He turned to face her. I want to do something, but I do not know if it is right. I do not know if it will work. And I find that I am, he stopped, swallowed, tried again. I am afraid. Elena waited. I want to call a gathering, Declan said. The whole pack. And I want to propose reforms. Real reforms. Not just words. Laws. He began to pace the way he probably did in the war room when planning campaigns, but his movements were less controlled now, jagged with energy and fear. End the barn system. Completely. No more separating wolves based on whether they can shift. Everyone gets shelter, food, medical care, as a baseline right, not a privilege earned through rank. He turned to her. Establish a council. A real one, not just warriors and ranked wolves, but healers and scouts, and you. A council with authority independent of the Alpha, with the power to overturn my decisions if they are unjust. His voice was rising now, gaining momentum. Change the succession laws. Make the alpha seat something earned through service, not inherited through blood. Elected every 10 years. So that no one can do what my father did and call it birthright. He stopped in front of her. But I do not know if the pack will accept it. I do not know if they will see it as strength or weakness. And I do not... He broke off and the vulnerability in his face was startling. I do not know if I can do this alone. Elena looked at him. At this man who had been raised to believe that certainty was the only currency that mattered, that doubt was death, that a leader who admitted fear was not a leader at all. And here he was stripped of all of that, asking for help. You are not alone, Elena said. The words were simple, obvious even. But Declan's face transformed as if she had given him something precious. Will you stand with me? He asked. When I call the gathering, will you take? I will, Elena said. Because she understood now in a way she had not 3 days ago that this was not about her. Not really. It was about what her presence made possible. The questions her existence forced the pack to ask. The assumptions her survival had cracked open. She was not a leader. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. But she was a catalyst. And sometimes that was enough. Declan exhaled long and slow as if he had been holding his breath for days. Thank you, he said. Then he did something Elena did not expect. He held out his hand, not as an alpha to a subject, but as one person to another, palm open, offering connection, not command. Elena looked at his hand for a long moment, then she reached out and took it. His grip was warm, steady, and for the first time since her mother died 15 years ago, Elena felt the particular kind of safety that comes from being seen by another person and not found wanting. They stood there in the quiet room, hands clasped as the afternoon light slanted through the window and turned the river stone's quartz vein into a line of captured fire. Outside, the pack moved through its rhythms, wolves training, hunters returning, children playing in the snow. But inside this small room at the end of the east corridor, something new was being built. Not a hierarchy, not a command structure, a partnership. And when Declan finally released her hand and turned to leave, Elena noticed that his shoulders no longer trembled. He walked like a man who had found solid ground. The gathering was called for the 16th day after the manifestation, and by dawn, the entire compound knew what was coming. Not because Declan had announced it with Alpha Command or formal proclamation, but because news moved through Thornridge the way water moved through stone, slowly at first, then all at once, finding every crack and crevice until there was no corner left untouched. The Alpha was going to propose changes, real changes, the kind that rewrote the foundation rather than patching the walls, and the Lunarisma would stand beside him. Elena woke that morning to find Ash already awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor with his collection of river stones arranged in careful patterns. The child had been gathering them for days now, smooth gray ovals with veins of white and amber, and sometimes a deep rust red that looked like dried blood. He lined them up by size, by color, by some internal logic that Elena could not quite parse, but recognized as important. Are you nervous? Ash asked without looking up from his work. Elena pulled on her boots. New ones now, properly fitted, a gift from Nessa that she had finally accepted after the healer had pointed out that frostbite was not a badge of honor and considered the question. Yes, she said. Why, well, I am. Because what we are trying to do has never been done before, and things that have never been done before are frightening. Ash looked up at her with those violet eyes that still startled her every time she saw them. Eyes that should not exist. Eyes that were proof the goddess had opinions about how the world should be run. But you will do it anyway, Ash said. It was not a question. Yes. Why, wait. Elena came and knelt beside him, looking at the stones arranged in their careful rows. Because frightening things are still worth doing if they are right. Ash nodded as if this made perfect sense, which perhaps it did when you were 4 years old and had been dead and then not dead, and understood that the rules everyone else followed were more flexible than they appeared. He picked up one of the stones, a small, smooth one with quartz threaded through like silver wire, and held it out to her. For luck, he said. Elena took it, feeling the familiar weight, the cool smoothness against her palm. She already had her riverstone in her pocket, the one she had carried for 3 years. But she took this one too, closing her fingers around it. Thank you, she said. And then, because there was nothing left to do but begin, she stood and walked toward the door. The stone circle was already full when Elena arrived. 150 wolves, maybe more, packed into the ancient ring of standing stones that had witnessed every major decision in Thornridge's 200-year history. Every challenge, every trial, every moment when the pack had to choose between what it had always been and what it might become. The air was electric with tension, thick with the musk of agitated wolves and the metallic edge of adrenaline. The temperature had dropped overnight 18 degrees Fahrenheit, According to the stolen radio, Elena still kept hidden under her floorboards, and breath plumed white in the clear morning air, creating a fog of anticipation that hung over the gathering like a living thing. Declan stood at the center of the circle, and he was not wearing his armor. No leather, no fur, no carved wolf skull pauldrons or iron-studded bracers. Just a simple wool shirt and leather trousers and boots that had seen hard use. His dark hair was pulled back in a warrior's knot, but loosely as if he had tied it himself without the help of attendants. He looked, Elena thought, like a man rather than a monument, and that was precisely the point. Elder Morel stood to his right, her lightning-struck oak staff planted in the frozen ground. To his left stood Nessacorn Thane and a young she-wolf named Lyra, who could not have been more than 19 and looked terrified to be standing in the inner circle with the pack's leadership. A space had been left open beside Declan. For her. Elena walked forward and the crowd parted, not dramatically, but with that same careful deference she had been navigating for 16 days now. The space between reverence and fear, between respect and uncertainty. She took her place beside Declan, and he glanced at her once quick and assessing, as if checking that she was real and still there, and had not changed her mind about standing with him in front of 150 wolves who might decide that what he was about to propose was treason. She gave him a small nod. His shoulders settled just slightly, and he turned to face the pack. "I have been your alpha for 12 years, Declan said. His voice carried across the circle without the weight of alpha command. Just projection, the natural authority of someone who had spent a lifetime learning how to make himself heard. In that time, I have made decisions I believed were necessary. Decisions I told myself served the pack, preserved our strength, honored the traditions my father left me." He paused, and the silence was absolute. 16 days ago, I ordered a 4-year-old child to be taken to the river and left to die. Not because the child had committed a crime, not because the child posed a threat, but because of a name. Because 30 years ago, the child's grandfather challenged my father for this seat, and my father answered that challenge with massacre. His voice did not waver, but Elena saw his hands tighten at his sides. I told myself it was justice, that the sins of the grandfather lived in the blood, that to allow a Thornborn to survive was to invite future conflict. He looked across the circle, meeting eyes holding gazes. I was wrong. The words fell like stones into water, sending ripples outward through the assembled pack. I was wrong about the child. I was wrong about the bloodline, and I was wrong about what strength means. He gestured to Elena without looking at her, a simple motion that nevertheless felt weighted with significance. This woman walked through my alpha command to save a dying child. She has no wolf, no rank, no power that our hierarchy recognizes. And yet the goddess chose her to bear a gift that has not appeared in Thornridge for 400 years. He turned to face her now fully, and there was something in his steel gray eyes that looked almost like wonder. She taught me that strength is not the absence of mercy. It is the presence of it. That power means nothing if it is not used to protect those who have no power of their own. He looked back at the pack. So I am asking you to do something that has never been done in Thornridge's history. I am asking you to change. Not the surface, not the decorative laws that we pretend matter, but the foundation. He took a breath. I am proposing 5 reforms, and I am asking every adult wolf here to vote on them. Majority rules. Even if you vote against me, I will honor the outcome. A murmur ran through the crowd. Shock, confusion, the particular disorientation that comes from having the ground shift beneath your feet. First, Declan said, and his voice cut through the murmuring like a blade. The barn system ends completely. No wolf, regardless of rank or ability to shift, will ever sleep in a barn again. All pack members are entitled to shelter, food, and medical care as baseline rights, not privileges earned through service or blood. Rights. He waited for that to settle. Second, a healer's council will be established consisting of 7 members chosen for their expertise in medicine, conflict resolution, and ethical guidance. This council will have authority independent of the alpha. They can overturn my decisions on medical or ethical grounds. Their word in matters of care and justice will be final. Elena felt the weight of 150 pairs of eyes turned toward her, but she kept her gaze forward on Declan, on the future he was trying to build. The council will consist of Elena Harrow as chair, healer Nessa Elder Morel Iris Meadowbrook, representing the Omegas, Corin, representing the Warriors, Lyra, representing the Youth, and Thane as investigator and ethical oversight. Lyra made a small sound, almost a gasp, and Elena glanced at her. The young she-wolf looked like she was about to faint or bolt or both. Elena reached out and took her hand, quick and firm, a silent message: "You can do this. We will teach you." Lyra's fingers closed around hers, trembling, but holding. Third, Declan continued, the alpha seat will no longer be inherited. Starting with my tenure, alphas will be elected every 10 years by vote of all adult pack members. Leadership is not a birthright. It is a trust earned through service and renewed through continued service. The murmuring grew louder now, edging toward argument. Elena could see wolves turning to each other, debating in urgent whispers. This was the reform that would cut deepest, the one that challenged not just policy, but identity. The belief that some wolves were born to lead and others born to follow. Declan's voice rose not with command, but with conviction. My father ruled this pack for 35 years. He was a great warrior, a brilliant strategist, and he was also a tyrant who burned dens and salted ground and taught his son that mercy was weakness. His jaw tightened. I do not want to be my father. And I do not want Thornridge to be the kind of pack that produces fathers like mine. So I am asking you to choose your leaders, to hold them accountable, to make them earn the right to stand in this circle and speak for you. He let that hang in the cold air. Fourth, the Thornborn lands, 15,000 acres in the northern range, are hereby restored to Ash Thornborn to be held in trust until he reaches 18 years of age. The massacre of his family was not justice. It was murder dressed in the language of law. We cannot bring back the dead, but we can acknowledge that they were wronged, and we can make restitution to the living. Elena felt something tight in her chest loosen just slightly. The child who had followed her around the infirmary for 16 days, who arranged stones in careful patterns, who trusted her with a completeness that still terrified her, that child would have a future. Land, legacy, the thing his family had been killed for. And fifth, Declan said, and his voice gentled, as if this last one cost him something to say. Discrimination based on the ability or inability to shift is now a criminal offense. Verbal abuse, physical assault, denial of care or resources, all of it is prosecuted the same as if the victim were ranked. Penalties include fines, community service, and for repeat offenders, exile. He paused. We have called those without wolves hollow for long enough. From this day forward, they are pack. Full members with full rights. And anyone who treats them as less will answer for it. The silence that followed was different from before. Heavier, charged with the weight of decision. Declan looked across the circle one more time. These are the reforms I propose, not as commands, as questions. The pack will vote, and the pack will decide what kind of place Thornridge will be. He stepped back, and Elder Morell stepped forward, her staff striking the frozen ground with a sound like a hammer on an anvil. We will vote by standing, she said. One reform at a time. Those in favor stand to the right. Those opposed stand to the left. Abstentions may remain seated. She lifted her staff. Reform 1, the end of the barn system. All members entitled to shelter, food, and medical care as rights. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Iris Meadowbrook, the kitchen woman, who had brought Elena fresh bread, stood and walked to the right side of the circle. Then Corin, then Nessa, then Thane, then a flood. Wolves rising, moving, choosing. Not all of them. Elena could see perhaps 8 who walked to the left, shoulders stiff with disapproval. But the right side swelled, 100, 110, 142 wolves standing in favor of the reform. Morell counted, her clouded eyes somehow tracking movement that should have been invisible to her. 142 in favor, 8 opposed. Reform 1 passes. A cheer went up from the right side of the circle, quickly suppressed, but unmistakable. Reform 2, establishment of the Healers' Council with independent authority. This time the split was closer. Perhaps 14 wolves walked to the left. But 136 stood to the right, and when Morell announced the count, Elena felt Lyra's hand tighten in hers. We passed, the young she-wolf whispered, disbelief threading through her voice. We passed, Elena confirmed. Reform 3, elected alpha system, 10-year terms, leadership by service, not blood. This was the one that would break them or remake them. Elena watched as wolves stood and chose, slower this time, more hesitation. The weight of 200 years of tradition pressing down on shoulders, making each step toward the right side feel like walking through deep water. But they came. Not all. Perhaps 22 wolves stood to the left, their faces set in hard lines of disapproval. But 128 stood to the right. And when Morell announced the count, 128 in favor, 22 opposed, reform 3 passes. The cheer that went up was louder, more sustained, edged with something that sounded almost like hope. Declan's face remained carefully neutral, but Elena saw his throat work, saw him swallow hard against something that might have been tears or triumph, or the dizzy relief of someone who had bet everything on a single roll and won. Reform 4, restoration of Thornborn lands to Ash Thornborn. 138 in favor, 12 opposed. Reform 5, Anti-Discrimination Law, Criminal Penalties for Abuse Based on Shift Status. 145 in favor, 5 opposed. And just like that, it was done. Thornridge had voted to change itself. Not completely, not unanimously, but by overwhelming majority, the PAC had chosen to become something different than it had been. Morrell struck her staff against the ground 3 times, the sound echoing across the stone circle like a benediction. Let it be witnessed. Let it be recorded. Let it be known that on this day, the 16th day after the Lunarisma manifested, Thornridge chose a new path. The crowd erupted, not in celebration exactly, but in the kind of release that comes after long-held tension finally breaks. Wolves embracing, arguing, crying, laughing, all of it at once, a chaos of emotion too large to be contained by any single response. And in the center of it all, Declan turned to Elena. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was rough with everything he could not say in front of the PAC. "You did this," Elena said. "Not me." "No," Declan said, and there was a fierceness in his eyes that reminded her suddenly that he was still an alpha, even if he had just voted to make that seat temporary. "We did this. Together." He held out his hand again, palm open, offering partnership. And this time when Elena took it, the PAC saw their alpha and the Lunarisma standing hand in hand in the center of the stone circle. Saw the future they had just voted for made visible in the space between 2 people who should never have been peers, but had decided to be anyway. And the howl that went up then was not submission, it was celebration. But the day was not over. As the crowd dispersed, as wolves drifted back toward the longhouse and the training grounds, and the 1,000 ordinary tasks that made up PAC life, Declan called a smaller gathering. The 7 members of the newly established Healers Council, plus a handful of senior warriors and Elder Morrell. They met in the Alpha's study, a room Elena had never entered in 21 years of living in Thornridge. It was smaller than she expected, less grand, just a large desk, a fireplace, walls lined with maps and rosters, and the accumulated paperwork of running a pack of 150 wolves. Declan stood by the window looking out at the river at the place where everything had changed. "There is one more thing I need to do," he said without turning around. "One more reform that I did not put to a vote because it is not about policy. It is about accountability." He turned to face them. "For the next 30 days, I am removing myself from the Alpha quarters. I will sleep in the barracks with the common warriors. I will eat at the communal table, not the Alpha's table. I will take orders from Corin, who will serve as acting head of security." Corin's eyes widened. "Alpha, you do not need to." "I do," Declan said, and his voice was gentle but immovable. "I have lived my entire life in privilege. I have given orders, but never taken them. I have commanded respect, but never had to earn it through anything but blood." He looked around the room. "If I am asking the PAC to change, I need to change first. I need to understand what it is to be governed rather than to govern, to be subject to the same rules I enforce, to walk in the shoes of those I lead." He pulled the Alpha pendant from around his neck, a leather cord with a carved wolf fang, and placed it on the desk. 30 days. "And then if the council believes I have earned the right to lead, I will ask for it back. Not as a birthright, but as a trust." The silence in the room was profound. Then Elder Morrell laughed. It was a rough creaking sound like a door that had not been opened in years finally giving way. "You are either the wisest Alpha Thornridge has ever had," she said, "or the most foolish. But either way, you are the one we need." She struck her staff against the floor. 30 days. The council will observe. And at the end, we will decide if you have earned what you were born to. Declan nodded once, sharp and military. Then he walked out of his own study, leaving the pendant behind, and went to the barracks to claim a bunk among the warriors he had commanded for 12 years. And Elena, watching him go, felt something she had not felt since her mother died. Pride. Not in herself, but in what they were building together. The days that followed were strange and tender, like the first week after a long illness, when the body remembers what it feels like to move without pain. Elena threw herself into the work of the Healers Council with a focus that surprised her. She had spent 21 years learning to survive in the margins, but survival skills she discovered translated well to governance. The careful observation required to read a room, the ability to find resources where none appeared to exist, the particular kind of courage it took to speak truth when silence would be easier. The council's first case came on the 3rd day after the reforms passed. An elderly wolf named Aldrich, 78 years old, came to the council chambers, a repurposed storage room in the longhouse that still smelled faintly of grain and leather, with a complaint against the PAC's former senior healer, a man named Brennan, who had retired after Nessa took over. Aldrich had served the PAC for 60 years, warrior, teacher, mentor to 2 generations of young wolves. But age and old battle wounds had caught up with him. 3 broken ribs from a fight at 34, a shattered hip from a fall at 52, arthritis that had settled into his joints like frost into stone. He had asked Brennan for pain medication. Simple willow bark tea. Natural, non-addictive, the kind of thing any healer would dispense without question. Brennan had refused. Weakness should not be coddled, Brennan had said. Pain is the body's way of telling you that you have lived too long as a warrior. Accept it or die with honor. Aldrich had accepted it because he had been taught all his life that to question a healer was to question the goddess herself. But now standing in front of the council, his hands shaking with pain he had endured for 12 years, he was questioning. I gave this pack everything, Aldrich said, and his voice was steady despite the tremor in his body. My youth, my strength, my blood. And when I asked for comfort in my old age, I was told that comfort was weakness. He looked at Elena, at the hollow girl who was somehow now sitting in judgment. Is that justice? Is that what we are? The council deliberated for less than an hour. The decision was unanimous. Nessa stood and read the verdict aloud, her voice carrying across the small room with the weight of something that would be remembered. Aldrich served this pack with honor for 60 years. Pain management is not coddling. It is basic care. It is the minimum we owe to those who gave us their best years. She looked at Brennan, who sat in the corner of the room with his arms crossed and his face set in disapproving lines. Your medical knowledge is not in question. Your judgment is. You confuse strength with endurance and mercy with weakness. Those are not the same thing, she paused. You will serve 100 hours of community service, learning elder care from those who understand that care is not failure. You will publicly apologize to Aldrich, and you will never again deny medication to someone in pain without medical justification. Brennan's face flushed red. This is you cannot. I was enforcing standards that have existed for... Standards that were wrong, Morell interrupted, and her clouded eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him flinch. Standards that confused cruelty with tradition. Those standards are dead, Brennan. You can die with them, or you can learn to live without them. She struck her staff against the floor. Choose. Brennan chose. Reluctantly. Resentfully. But he chose. And when Aldrich walked out of the council chambers with a month's supply of willow bark tea and a promise of ongoing care, he wept. Not from pain, but from the overwhelming relief of finally, after 12 years, being heard. Word of the council's decision spread through the pack within hours, and by nightfall, 3 more wolves had come forward with similar stories. Denied care, told their pain was weakness, taught to suffer in silence because suffering was somehow more noble than asking for help. The council heard them all and ruled in their favor, every single time. By the end of the first week, it was clear that something fundamental had shifted in Thornridge, not just policy, but the underlying assumption about what the pack owed its members and what members owed the pack. The transaction was no longer one way. And Elena, sitting in the council chambers late one night, reviewing cases with Nessa and Morell and Lyra, felt that same unfamiliar sensation she had felt when Iris brought her fresh bread. Belonging. She was not just surviving anymore. She was building. On the 18th day after the reforms passed, a war horn sounded. Elena was in the council chambers when she heard it, that deep, bone-rattling bellow that shook the frost from the window frames and sent every wolf in the compound to immediate alert. The horn of formal challenge. Someone was calling for the alpha seat. She ran toward the stone circle, Ash scrambling to keep up with her. The compound was already assembling. Warriors in full leather armor lined the path from the longhouse to the standing stones, where every alpha challenge in Thornridge's history had been fought and settled. The air was electric, with tension thick with the musk of agitated wolves and the metallic edge of adrenaline. The challenger stood at the center of the stone circle, stripped to the waist. A warrior named Rolf, perhaps 35 years old, lean and scarred with cold eyes that held no doubt. Declan Voss, Rolf's voice carried across the silent compound. You have abandoned the old ways. You kneel to a hollow. You give Omega Wolves power over ranked warriors. You make the alpha seat something to be voted on like a market transaction. He spat on the frozen ground. You are weak, and Thornridge deserves better. Declan walked to the stones. He wore no armor, just the simple clothes he had been wearing for 18 days. But there was something in his posture, a centered calm, that made him seem larger than he had before. What do you propose? Declan asked, his voice carrying without strain. Formal challenge, Rolf said. To the death or submission, winner takes the alpha seat. The pack will follow strength, not sentiment. Elder Morell stepped forward, her staff striking the ground. This is law, she said. Ancient law. No wolf may interfere. The stones will witness. The goddess will decide. She looked at Declan. Do you accept? Declan looked across the circle and found Elena's eyes, held them for a long moment. Then he nodded. I accept. The fight was savage. Rolf struck first, shifting mid-lunge, his human form collapsing and reforming in a blur of gray fur and muscle. His wolf was fast built for precision strikes, and he drove Declan backward with a ferocity that made the watching pack murmur in concern. Declan's wolf, massive slate gray, thick as a warhorse, absorbed the first assault, taking hits that would have felled a smaller wolf. But Elena could see the strategy. Declan was not fighting the way his father had taught him. He was fighting defensively, protecting, waiting. The two wolves clashed again and again, the sound of it, terrible, deep, guttural snarling, the crack of teeth on bone, the wet tearing of claws through flesh. And then in the seventh exchange, Declan had it. The opening. Clean. Perfect. Jaws positioned for the killing blow to the spine. He hesitated. Just a heartbeat. Just a fraction of a second where the old Declan and the new Declan warred inside him. And Rolf's claws raked across Declan's shoulder, opening 3 deep gouges that painted the standing stones red. Declan staggered but did not fall. And in that moment, Elena understood what he was doing. He was not fighting to kill. He was fighting to prove that strength could choose mercy, even when it cost him blood. Declan surged forward, not with his jaws, but with his bulk, using his superior mass to drive Rolf into one of the standing stones. The impact cracked granite. Rolf's wolf yelped, stunned, and Declan pinned him there. Jaws at the throat. The killing position. The pack held its breath, and Declan stepped back, released him, showed mercy. Rolf scrambled to his feet, panting, bleeding from a dozen wounds. His eyes were wild, confused. He had expected death or dominance. Not this. Not compassion from someone who had every right to kill him. I could end you, Declan said, his wolf's voice a deep rumble that somehow still sounded like him. But I choose not to, because strength is not about who can kill the most efficiently. It is about who can build something worth protecting. He shifted back to human form, bleeding, exhausted, but standing. You challenged because you believed I had grown weak. And by the old measures, perhaps I have. I do not rule through fear anymore. I do not demand obedience without question. I have knelt. I have admitted I was wrong. I have given power to those who had none. He looked at the assembled pack. But I am not weaker for it. I am stronger. Because now I lead wolves who choose to follow me, not wolves who are compelled to. He turned back to Rolf. You are exiled for 5 years, not for challenging me, that is your right, but for believing that cruelty is the same as strength. When you return better. The pack stood in stunned silence. Then slowly a howl began, not from one wolf but from many. A rising chorus of voices that was not submission, but something Elena had never heard before in Thornridge. Approval. Recognition. The celebration of a leader who had won not by destroying his opponent, but by showing him what victory could look like when it was built on principles instead of violence. And as the guards escorted Rolf to the northern gate, as Declan's wounds were tended by Nessa, as the pack dispersed with new understanding in their eyes, Elena realized something. The transformation was complete, not because the rules had changed, but because the people had. On the 20th day after the reforms passed, Declan came to Elena's room. He looked different than he had 3 weeks ago. Leaner, harder. His hands were calloused in new places from work he had not done since his youth, hauling, water-chopping, wood-cleaning weapons, all the small, unglamorous tasks that kept a pack running, but that alphas rarely touched. His hair was longer, starting to curl at the ends where it touched his collar. His eyes had a new light in them, something bright and almost wild, as if he had discovered a truth that both terrified and exhilarated him. The wounds from Rolf's challenge were healing 3 parallel lines across his shoulder that would scar. I have been thinking, he said, standing in her doorway the same way he had 3 weeks ago, waiting for permission to enter. Elena gestured him in. He came and stood by the window, looking at the 3 objects on her sill. The carved goddess figure, the river stone, and now a third, the small, smooth stone that Ash had given her with quartz threaded through like silver wire. 3 stones, Declan said softly. What do they mean? Elena came to stand beside him. Proof that rough things can become smooth, that broken things can be beautiful, that time and pressure and waters can transform what seems permanent. Declan was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a stone of his own, a twin to hers, smooth and cool with that same thread of white quartz, like a lightning strike frozen in stone. I found this 2 weeks ago, Declan said, on the riverbank, the same place where you saved Ash. I have been carrying it, trying to decide if... He stopped, swallowed, tried again. I want to court you. The words came out in a rush, unpolished, nothing like the careful commands he had spent 12 years perfecting. Not as alpha to omega, not as leader to follower, but as partners, as two people who have walked through fire and come out changed and want to keep walking. Together, he held out the stone. I do not know if I am worthy of you. I do not know if I will ever be, but I want to try, if you will let me. Lena looked at the stone in his hand, at the man offering it, at the future implicit in the gesture. She thought about the girl she had been 20 days ago, the hollow girl in the barn who had believed she would never be anything but empty. And she thought about the woman she was becoming, the Lunarisma, the council chair, the person who had learned that emptiness was not absence but possibility. She took the stone. Yes, she said, and watched as Declan's face transformed, fear giving way to something radiant and unguarded. But not yet, Elena continued. Not while you are still learning what it means to be subject to the same rules you enforce. Not while you are still discovering who you are when you are not the alpha. She placed the stone on the windowsill beside the other three. When your 30 days are done, when the council has decided if you have earned the right to lead, when we know what kind of future we are building. She turned to face him fully. Then ask me again, as the man you will have become, and I will answer as the woman I will be. Declan nodded slowly and something in his shoulders relaxed. As partners, he said, in everything. In everything, Elena confirmed. And they stood there in the quiet room, 4 stones on the windowsill catching the last light of day, and neither of them needed to say anything more. The future was being built. 1 stone at a time, 1 decision at a time, 1 morning at a time, and that was enough, for now. Spring came to Thornridge like a slow exhale. The river thawed in stages. First the surface cracking into plates of gray ice that drifted downstream and caught the light like broken mirrors. Then the banks where the mud softened and the first shoots of wild garlic pushed through green and insistent. By the time the willows put out their catkins soft silver-furred buds that made the trees look like they were wearing crowns, the valley had transformed from a place of iron and frost into something almost gentle. Elena sat on the riverbank in the exact spot where Ash had been laid to die 6 months ago. She was not the same woman who had knelt here. Her copper hair was loose today, catching the afternoon sun. She wore a dress of deep forest green alpha mate colors, though she had argued with Nessa for a week about accepting it. On her left hand, a simple silver band caught the light. Mated 3 months ago after a 3-month courtship that had been observed by the entire pack with an intensity that still made her uncomfortable. But the discomfort was worth it. Because Declan sat beside her now, his hand resting easy on her knee, and the touch was partnership, not possession. Ash waded knee-deep in the shallows, chasing minnows with a concentration that bordered on ferocity. The boy was bigger now, 5 years old as of last week, still small for his age but filling out. The skeletal fragility of his first weeks had been replaced by the sturdy, compact energy of a child who was eating regularly, sleeping safely, and being loved without condition. His violet eyes flashed as he lunged for a fish and missed, sending up a spray of water that caught the sunlight and scattered into 1,000 tiny prisms. Almost, he announced, more delighted than frustrated. You'll get the next one, Elena said. She turned the river stone in her hand, her original stone, the one she had carried for 3 years. It sat now on a flat rock beside 3 others. Declan's twin stone, Ash's gift with the silver wire of quartz, and a 4th smaller one that Ash had found just yesterday, perfectly round, that he had declared was for the pack. 4 stones on a rock in the sun, a girl who had been hollow, a man who had learned to kneel, a child who had been condemned, a pack that had chosen to transform. I have news, Declan said, breaking the comfortable silence. Elena looked at him. His hair was longer now, tied back loosely. The scar on his shoulder from Rolf's challenge had healed into 3 parallel lines that he wore without shame. The council had voted unanimously 30 days after the reforms to return his alpha pendant, but he wore it differently now. Not as armor, as responsibility. Corin has been promoted to head of security, Declan continued. He has earned it 3 times over. And the council approved the regional network. 4 neighboring packs have established their own healers' councils modeled on ours. Elena smiled. The transformation was spreading. Slower than she had hoped, faster than she had dared believe. Iris wants to open a regional kitchen, she said. Free meals for any pack member in need funded by the common stores. The council will vote on it next week. It will pass, Declan said with certainty. They sat in comfortable silence watching Ash play. Then Elena felt it. The same prickling awareness she had learned to recognize over the past 6 months. Someone approaching. She turned. A wolf stood at the edge of the clearing. Female mid-30s, scarred and exhausted. Her clothes were travel-worn, her boots caked with mud from what must have been a long journey. Lunarisma, the woman said, and her voice cracked on the word. I am sorry to intrude. My name is Vera. I have traveled 300 miles to find you. Elena stood, Declan rising with her. You are not intruding, Elena said. What do you need? Vera's face crumpled, and for a moment Elena thought she might collapse. I heard stories, Vera said, of a Lunarisma in the Montana territories who changed a pack, who brought down a corrupt beta, who made an alpha kneel and then stand back up as something better. She took a shaking breath. I need your help. My niece, her name is Sable, 19 years old. She has no wolf. The new alpha of Silverpine keeps her in a cage, smaller than a barn, smaller than anything. Vera's hands clenched. The old Alpha Ronin tried to reform after he heard what Thornridge had done, but he was challenged. He lost. The new Alpha reversed everything. Sable has been caged for 2 months. I tried to free her. I was exiled for the attempt. She looked at Elena with desperate hope. Can you help her? Like you helped yourself? Elena looked at Declan, saw the same thought moving behind his eyes that was moving behind hers. They had built something here, something real. But if they kept it only for Thornridge, it would not be enough. The goddess had given her this gift not for one pack, but for all wolves who suffered, especially the ones who suffered as she had. We will help, Elena said. Not I. We. Declan nodded once firm and certain. We go together, he said. Not as conquerors, as witnesses. We will show them what Thornridge has become, and offer them the chance to change. Vera's knees buckled with relief. Declan caught her before she fell. 300 miles, Elena said, already calculating. 4 days' journey if we move fast. We will need supplies, a small party. The council will need to approve my absence. They will approve, Lyra's voice came from behind them. The young she-wolf had grown in confidence over 6 months, and she stood now with Nessa and Morel and Corin, all of whom had followed when they sensed something important was happening. We have been preparing for this, Morel said, leaning on her lightning-struck oak staff. Did you think your story would stay contained within Thornridge? The old wolf's clouded eyes seemed to see straight through Elena. I waited 83 years for the Lunarisma to return. And when she finally did, I knew she would not be content to heal only one pack. She smiled rare and fierce. Go, free the caged girl, show them what we have learned, and come back to us. That evening, Elena stood at the longhouse window, looking out at the compound that had been her prison and was now her home. Ash was asleep in her quarters, safe and warm, his collection of stones arranged on the nightstand. The council was meeting below, planning the journey, mapping routes, selecting who would travel with them. And Declan stood beside her, his hand finding hers in the darkness. Are you afraid? He asked. Elena thought about the question, about the girl she had been 6 months ago, about the woman she was now. Yes, she said, but I have learned that frightening things are still worth doing if they are right. She turned to face him. For 21 years, I believe my emptiness made me worthless. But emptiness is not absence, it is space. Space for light, space for growth, space for others who have been hollowed out by the world's cruelty. She squeezed his hand. We are not hollow anymore. We are vessels, and we will pour forth until every cage is opened, every barn is emptied, every broken thing is made smooth. Declan raised her hand to his lips, pressed a kiss to her knuckles. Then we go, he said, together. Elena looked out the window one more time, at the barn that had been converted into a healing center, at the monument on the eastern wall with 17 Thornborn names carved in stone, at the wolves moving through the compound with purpose and dignity and something that looked almost like joy. They had built this, one stone at a time, one decision at a time, one morning at a time, and now they would build it again, somewhere else, for someone else, for every Sable still trapped in a cage, for every hollow girl waiting to learn that emptiness is not death, but possibility. The moon rose full and silver over Thornridge, and Elena felt a familiar hum inside her chest. The door that had cracked open 6 months ago on a frozen riverbank. The goddess had chosen her for a reason, and the work was just beginning. In a barn smaller and darker than the one Elena had survived, a girl named Sable, huddled in a cage barely large enough to lie down in. 19 years old, copper-haired, amber-eyed, without a wolf. She pressed her face against the cold iron bars and whispered into the darkness, "Please, someone, anyone." And in the distance, so faint she might have imagined it, a light flickered, white, warm, coming closer.